Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come alive again in the dark. Before sleep overtakes you, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself go, because what you're about to hear is real. Case 1. The crime occurred in an abandoned coffee shop in the city center, a place that had closed years ago and was now in a state of disrepair. The lights were still partially working, allowing investigators to clearly see the scene. It was as if the old building wanted to cooperate, offering its last dance of light before surrendering all its secrets. The victim was found sitting in a chair, her hands tied behind her back and a brown paper bag over her head. There was a pool of blood under the chair, originating from a gunshot wound to the back of her head. The murder weapon, a semi-automatic pistol, was lying a few feet away as if it had been carelessly thrown. The cafe, formerly known as Café Silencio, was an iconic spot in the 1980s. Back then, its polished wooden tables and vintage lamps were a meeting point for artists, writers, and dreamers seeking inspiration over steaming cups of black coffee. But over time, it lost its clientele due to the rise of more modern and affordable coffee chains. The building was forgotten, becoming a haven for homeless people and teenagers seeking nocturnal adventures. However, that night, the place became the scene of a brutal murder, one that would resonate in the collective memory for years. Investigators noticed that the windows were broken and covered in dust, while tables and chairs were stacked haphazardly against the walls. Some of them had been moved recently, suggesting that someone had prepared the space specifically for the crime. It was evident that the killer had not only chosen this location for its isolation, but also because he wanted to control every detail of the environment. On the floor near the victim, male shoe prints were found, as well as drag marks indicating that the victim had been brought there from another location. Investigators wondered, why here? Why now? In addition to the pistol, investigators discovered a small lighter with an engraved design, likely lost by one of the suspects. Shards of broken glass near the entrance showed signs of having been recently stepped on, indicating someone had entered or left in a hurry. Each object found seemed to tell a part of the story, but many pieces were still missing to complete the puzzle. The cafe's remote location, coupled with its neglected condition, made it an ideal place to commit the crime unnoticed. However, the complete lack of privacy and the presence of key clues left traces that would eventually lead to solving the case. Although the killer had tried to erase any evidence, something always remains when acting under pressure. A lingering odor, a poorly erased fingerprint, a trail invisible to even the most trained eye. And that was precisely what the detective in charge of the investigation was determined to find. Detective Elliot Grayson was a middle-aged man with an imposing demeanor and a gaze that seemed capable of piercing through the most elaborate lies. With 20 years of experience on the force, Grayson had solved some of the city's most complex cases, but this one was different. From the moment he walked through the doors of Café Silencio, he felt he was dealing with something deeper, darker. As he slowly walked through the crime scene, his eyes examined every detail, absorbing every irregularity. He knew the killer had made a mistake, even if it was minuscule. Everyone does. The victim's body, dimly illuminated by the flickering lights, seemed almost peaceful in its forced position. But Grayson knew that calm was a mask. Behind the brown paper bag and the bound hands, there was a life cut violently and unjustly short. He noticed the pool of blood beneath the chair, its edges beginning to dry. The bullet wound in the back of the head indicated execution, but it also left room for questions. Had it been meticulously planned, or was it the product of an uncontrollable impulse? The pistol lying a few feet away seemed to scream negligence, but Grayson knew that appearances could be deceiving. As forensic technicians collected samples and documented every inch of the space, Grayson paused in front of one of the broken windows. He looked out at the shadows cast by the nearby buildings. He imagined the killer, perhaps nervous, perhaps furious, moving between these very walls. He thought of the victim, dragged here, possibly aware of what was about to happen. There was something deeply human about all this, something that went beyond the simple mechanics of a crime. It was a story of emotions, poor choices, and perhaps betrayals. The detective allowed himself a moment of reflection. He knew that every crime has its own rhythm, its own internal logic. This one would be no different. He just needed to follow the clues, listen to the voices silenced by violence, and above all, remain calm. because somewhere in the shadows of Café Silencio the truth was waiting to be discovered. Evangeline Hawthorne, a 28-year-old woman born in Salem, Massachusetts, was known for her enigmatic personality and her talent as an emerging writer. Inspired by the stories of witchcraft and local mysteries that shaped her childhood, Evangeline developed a fascination with dark and suspenseful tales from a young age. Winner of several regional awards for her short stories, she stood out for her unique style of capturing complex emotions with almost poetic precision. Although she had yet to publish a full novel, she was hard at work on her first manuscript titled The Echo of Silence, a project centered on personal betrayals and buried secrets that some believe was inspired by her own life. She lived alone in a modest apartment on Beacon Hill, where she would spend long hours writing by her window while gazing out over the Charles River. Kind but reserved, she preferred solitude to constant company. With no criminal record or legal problems, she faced financial difficulties due to the instability of her freelance job as an editor for online magazines. What few knew was that Evangeline investigated strange events involving people close to her, details she intended to include in her next work. According to messages found on her computer, these investigations may have sparked hostility among those she scrutinized, casting a disturbing shadow over her life before her tragic end. With the first clues gathered at the Café Silencio, Detective Elliot Grayson knew it was time to delve deeper into Evangeline Hawthorne's relationships. Each person close to her could be a key piece in the puzzle. Contradictions, secrets, and hidden emotions would begin to emerge under the pressure of the questions. It was time to confront the possible parties involved, analyze their alibis, and discover what connections could have led to the tragic outcome. Interrogations would be the next step in unraveling the truth. Darius Calloway, a 35-year-old man with a look that alternated between determination and discouragement, was the living portrait of someone who had tried to build something big, only to see it crumble before his eyes. He was born in Boston, a city that always seemed full of opportunity, but also fierce competition. During his youth, Darius dreamed of opening his own themed restaurant, a place that would combine elements of local culture with a unique dining experience. He finally managed to make that dream a reality almost a decade ago, when he opened a small restaurant called Cocina en Cuento, a space where dishes were inspired by classic literary stories. For a while, everything seemed to be going well. The reviews were positive and reservations flowed steadily. However, as often happens with ambitious ventures, financial problems began to pile up. Bad decisions, coupled with poor cost management and premature overexpansion, brought the restaurant to the brink of collapse. Darius tried to save it, seeking investors and restructuring debts. But in the end, there was no way out. 3 years ago, he had to declare bankruptcy, a devastating blow to his self-esteem and his career. Since then, he had been working as a fast food delivery driver, a job that barely allowed him to pay the bills while he tried to rebuild his life. Although he still harbored hopes of starting a new business, his confidence was shattered, and the weight of failure haunted him like a constant shadow. It was during this stage of his life that Darius met Evangeline Hawthorne. The meeting occurred during a literary event hosted by a small local bookstore. That evening, the atmosphere was filled with lively conversation and quiet laughter, as emerging writers and literature lovers shared ideas. Darius, though never a big book lover, attended because he believed he might find inspiration for his next business venture, a concept combining food and modern narrative. It was there that he briefly met Evangeline, who stood out from the crowd with her enigmatic aura and her ability to discuss complex subjects with captivating simplicity. The two engaged in a brief conversation about contemporary narrative, a topic Darius barely touched on with superficial knowledge, but one that fascinated him from a creative perspective. Months after that encounter, Darius decided to contact Evangeline with an unusual proposal. He was developing a promotional script to attract investors to his new project, a kind of interactive literary cafe where customers could experience stories through the flavors and aromas of the dishes. Convinced that Evangeline possessed the necessary talent to capture the essence of his idea, he asked her for help writing the script. However, after reviewing his proposal, Evangeline declined, arguing that it lacked originality and coherence. This rejection deeply wounded Darius's ego, as he was already struggling with professional frustration and the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle of failure. For someone as insecure as he was, Evangeline's comment was perceived not only as a criticism of his project, but as a personal attack on his creative capacity. When Detective Elliot Grayson called Darius in for questioning, he appeared nervous but cooperative. Sitting across from the investigator, Darius explained that, at the time of the crime, he had been making deliveries in South Boston. He provided GPS records of his vehicle as proof of his whereabouts, but they did not exactly match the reported times of the murder. According to the records, Darius had completed his last confirmed delivery at 9:45 p.m., approximately 1 hour before Evangeline's death was estimated. A customer confirmed receiving their order at that time, but there was an unexplained gap between 10:15 p.m. and 11 p.m., a gap that piqued the detective's curiosity. Grayson noticed that Darius avoided eye contact during specific portions of his testimony, especially when he was discussing his relationship with Evangeline. He also observed that the man seemed genuinely affected by the news of the murder, although the possibility of it being a carefully rehearsed performance couldn't be ruled out. As he reviewed records and analyzed possible routes Darius could have taken that evening, Grayson kept thinking about the emotional impact Evangeline's rejection might have had on him. Was it possible that such a blow to his pride had led him to act impulsively? After all, the crime occurred in a remote, obscure location, ideal for someone who wanted to act unseen. But did Darius really have the emotional capacity and premeditation necessary to commit such a brutal act? The detective knew that, although Darius was a plausible suspect, he couldn't base the entire investigation solely on assumptions. He needed more evidence, more details connecting the man to the crime scene. So, as he wrapped up the interrogation, Grayson decided to delve into other aspects of Darius's life, including his recent movements, his personal relationships, and any clues that might reveal whether this man, marked by failure and frustration, was capable of crossing the fine line between resentment and crime. Serafina Blake, a 26-year-old whose presence commanded both admiration and bewilderment, was an unmistakable figure in the contemporary art world. Originally from Portland, Maine, she had arrived in Boston 5 years earlier with ambitious dreams and a portfolio full of multimedia installations that challenged the aesthetic and ethical conventions of art. Her work focused on exploring dark and surreal themes, addressing such delicate concepts as death, loneliness, and the limits of human morality. Each piece she created seemed destined to provoke a visceral reaction in the viewer, be it fascination, discomfort, or even rejection. Serafina had a volatile temperament, capable of swinging from moments of intense creativity to bursts of frustration that left their mark on those around her. However, her undeniable genius meant many were willing to tolerate her eccentricities. Since arriving in Boston, Serafina managed to break into the competitive art world thanks to her ability to create striking and original works. One of the people with whom she collaborated most was Evangeline Hawthorne, an emerging writer with whom she shared not only artistic interests but also a deep friendship that forged over the years. The two women had a special connection, fueled by long conversations about creative, philosophical, and even personal topics. Together, they participated in multiple joint exhibitions, merging narrative and visual art in projects that caught the attention of critics and viewers alike. Recently, however, that relationship began to show cracks. The creative and personal differences between them became evident, especially when Evangeline expressed concern that Serafina was using confidential material obtained during their private conversations to develop a new art installation. For Evangeline, this represented a violation of trust and an undue exploitation of her privacy, while Serafina argued that art should have no boundaries or ethical restrictions. When Detective Elliot Grayson called Serafina in for questioning, she appeared defensive but collected. She claimed to have spent the entire night working in her studio, located in the same building where she lived. She claimed to be immersed in the completion of a multimedia installation that she considered her most ambitious work to date. Several security cameras in the building showed activity in the hours leading up to the crime, capturing lights on and shadows moving within Serafina's assigned space. However, no footage directly showed the artist leaving or returning to the studio, leaving a gap in her alibi. Grayson noticed that Serafina avoided going into specific details about her routine that night, responding vaguely when asked about the exact time she was supposedly busy in her studio. The detective knew Serafina was a complex woman, someone unafraid to cross ethical boundaries in the name of her art. Her obsession with exploring the limits of morality could have led her to take extreme decisions if she felt her career or reputation were in danger. If Evangeline had threatened to publicly expose the misuse of personal information, This could have been enough to trigger an impulsive reaction in Serafina. Furthermore, her closeness to the victim made any conflict between them relevant to the investigation. Grayson recalled the long brown hairs found on the chair where Evangeline was tied. Although not yet officially confirmed, there was a possibility that they belonged to Serafina, given that they matched her tone and length. As he reviewed security camera footage and analyzed the accounts of other building residents, Grayson couldn't help but notice that something wasn't right about Serafina's story. Her insistence on staying inside the studio all night sounded convincing in theory, but lacked any hard evidence to back it up. Furthermore, her volatile nature and history of obsessive behavior raised the inevitable question: was she capable of committing an act as violent as murder? Grayson knew he had to be cautious. He couldn't allow his prejudices to influence his judgment. But he was also aware that in cases like this, appearances could be deceiving, and those closest to the victim often harbored unexpected secrets. For the detective, Serafina was an enigmatic puzzle. On the one hand, her talent and dedication to her art were undeniable, qualities that made her a respected figure within her professional circle. On the other hand, her explosive temper and willingness to challenge moral norms suggested that she could act without remorse if she felt her career or legacy were at stake. Grayson decided to delve into her personal life, investigating her recent movements, her relationships with others involved in the case, and any clues that could directly connect her to the crime scene. He knew that at some point the truth would come out, and if Serafina was involved, he would be the first to find out. After weeks of exhaustive investigation, the forensic team was able to identify DNA on the lighter found at the crime scene. It belonged to Serafina Blake, a revelation that dramatically changed the course of the investigation. Initially, Serafina vehemently denied having been present at the scene, arguing that she had no reason to visit an abandoned coffee shop in the middle of the night. However, under more rigorous questioning and faced with incriminating evidence, she began to unravel emotionally. Eventually, she admitted that she had gone to the coffee shop to confront Evangeline about the misuse of confidential material obtained during their private conversations. According to her initial account, she insisted that she left before anything out of the ordinary occurred. But inconsistencies in her testimony, coupled with new physical evidence, ultimately dismantled her defense. Detective Elliot Grayson noticed that Serafina was becoming increasingly agitated as she spoke, especially when questioned about the specific details of her confrontation with Evangeline. Initially, she described the argument as an intense but controlled verbal exchange, stating that she had withdrawn after becoming frustrated with Evangeline's lack of cooperation. However, long hair fibers found on the chair where the victim was bound matched samples taken from Serafina, a direct connection that placed her at the crime scene. Finally, pressed by mounting evidence, Serafina confessed to having lost control during the argument. According to her account, tensions escalated rapidly when Evangeline threatened to publicly expose her misuse of personal information in her new art installation. In a fit of rage, Serafina accidentally knocked one of the old metal lamps off Evangeline's head. Seeing that Evangeline was unconscious but still breathing, Serafina panicked. Fearing discovery, she decided to cover up the accident by faking a premeditated murder. She tied Evangeline to the chair, placed the brown paper bag over her head, and shot the victim in the back of the head. Her intention was to shift attention to Malcolm Hargrove, whose shady reputation and connections to shady activities made him a perfect scapegoat. Forensic analysis determined that the murder occurred between 10:15 p.m. and 10:45 p.m. Investigators estimated that Evangeline survived for at least 15 minutes after the initial impact, during which time she was likely semi-conscious due to the previous blow. This confirmed that the act was not entirely deliberate from the outset, but rather the product of an unexpected emotional escalation. The blood beneath the chair showed signs of partial clotting, indicating that Evangeline was still breathing when she was tied up and executed. The key detail that definitively solved the case was the combination of physical and digital evidence. Hair fibers stuck to the chair directly linked Serafina to the scene, while searches of her cell phone showed that she had carefully planned how to cover her tracks. Although she tried to simulate a premeditated crime, her attempt to shift blame onto Malcolm Hargrove only reinforced the hypothesis that she acted impulsively and subsequently tried to cover up. Ultimately, Serafina was found guilty of first-degree murder. During the trial, her attorney attempted to argue that the crime was accidental and that she acted under intense emotional duress. However, the cold-blooded manner in which she orchestrated the cover-up and the deliberate tampering with the crime scene led the jury to sentence her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of Evangeline Hawthorne, though tragic, served as a reminder of how an obsession with success and unbridled ambition can corrupt even those who seem to shine brightly. For Detective Elliot Grayson, solving this case was both a professional triumph and a lesson in the fragility of human relationships and the dangerous limits some people are willing to cross in the name of art and reputation. Case 2. In a small bookstore called The Paper Compass, located in the heart of a quiet coastal town called Gray Harbor, one gray morning, the sky covered by low clouds that seemed to embrace the land as if trying to protect it from something. The air smelled of salt and humidity, a mixture that had always been comforting to the locals, but that morning brought with it a different, unsettling feeling, as if something dark had infiltrated the cobblestone streets and old brick buildings. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. Noah Crenshaw arrived at the bookstore early as he did every day. He was one of the most dedicated employees there, someone who firmly believed in the power of stories to bring people together. However, that morning as he opened the front door, he immediately knew something wasn't right. The lights were off even though Clara, the owner, usually left them on overnight as a safety precaution. The silence inside the store was oppressive, almost palpable, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Noah felt a chill run down his spine as he slowly made his way inside. That's when he saw it. Behind the counter, Clara's body lay in a position that seemed deliberate, as if someone had wanted to leave a message with every detail. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the shelves lined with books, her limp hands resting in her lap. Her face, pale and lifeless, was tilted to one side, as if she'd been observing something just before she died. There were multiple knife wounds on her torso and abdomen, and a pool of dried blood spread beneath her, forming a dark halo that contrasted cruelly with the bookstore's welcoming surroundings. It was a place where words came to life, where stories inspired hope, but now, everything seemed tainted by violence. What most puzzled Noah, and later the investigators, was the meticulousness with which the body had been disposed of. There were no obvious signs of theft or vandalism, suggesting that the murder had personal, perhaps even emotional motivations. On the floor near the body were traces of an unknown chemical that appeared to have been intentionally spilled. Its pungent odor hung in the air, mixing with the usual scent of old paper and ink, creating a disturbing combination. There were also bloody fingerprints on the counter, footprints that seemed to indicate a struggle or perhaps a desperate attempt to grasp something before falling. A small, blood-stained screwdriver lay on the floor, an out-of-place object amid so much chaos. But what caught the most attention was the page torn from an ancient book pinned to the wall with a knife. The page was worn, with no legible text, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase its contents. However, its presence there, pierced by the knife, seemed to symbolize something deeper, something only the killer could understand. It was a disturbing detail, a sign no one knew how to interpret, but it made it clear this wasn't an impulsive act. Whoever had done this knew the place well and knew how to cover their tracks. The back door was ajar, but there were no clear footprints that could be easily traced. Everything indicated that the killer had planned every move carefully, leaving behind only clues he himself wanted to be found. The detective in charge of the investigation was an imposing figure, not because of her physique, but because of her presence. Her name was Julia Hart, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze that seemed capable of reading anyone's soul. She had been working on complicated cases for years, but this one had something different, something that deeply unsettled her. From the moment she walked into the bookstore, she could feel it. This was no ordinary crime. Julia was known for her meticulousness and her ability to connect seemingly insignificant details, but also for her empathy. As she examined the scene, she couldn't help but think about the irony that a place dedicated to words, to the beauty of stories, had become the scene of such a brutal tragedy. Julia began her work calmly, observing every corner of the bookstore as if she were reading between the lines. She noticed how the shelves were precisely arranged, how each book seemed to have its assigned place, reflecting Clara's meticulous personality. But now that harmony had been disrupted by violence. Julia stopped in front of the counter where Clara's body had been found and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to imagine what had happened there. She could visualize the struggle, the muffled sound of objects falling, the stifled scream of someone who hadn't expected what was about to happen. She knew the killer had left something behind, something that would reveal his identity if she managed to find it, but she also knew it wouldn't be easy. This case would require patience, intuition, and above all, a deep understanding of the shadows that lurk even in the most brightly lit places. As Julia continued her inspection, the weight of the scene began to become clear. This wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about restoring peace to a place that had been desecrated, about finding justice for someone who had dedicated her life to sharing stories with others. And in that moment, Julia knew she would do whatever it took to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took or how many layers she had to unravel. Clara Ellsworth, 32, was a passionate woman whose life revolved around books and the stories they contained. As the youngest of 3 children, she had always been the most introspective in the family, preferring to spend hours immersed in the pages of a book, rather than participating in social activities. Her parents, although they lived in another city, maintained a close relationship with her, proud of the path she had chosen to follow. Clara never married or had children, devoting her time and energy to building something truly her own. The Paper Compass, a small but charming bookstore she opened 5 years earlier with her own savings. The bookstore quickly became the cultural heart of Gray Harbor, attracting literature lovers and the curious alike. Clara not only sold books but also restored antique paper jewels, bringing them back to life with patience and skill. However, her love for the mysteries of the past led her beyond novels. As an active member of a historical research group, Clara dedicated her evenings to unraveling Gray Harbor's forgotten secrets. Recently, she had begun working on documents that suggested uncomfortable truths about influential figures in the town. These discoveries stirred tensions, especially with local investors who were pushing to buy her property and replace it with a resort. Clara resisted, defending her heritage and her home. But those same rumors placed her in a vulnerable position, making her a target for suspicious eyes and, perhaps, hidden dangers. With the crime scene documented and the initial clues analyzed, Detective Julia Hart knew it was time to delve deeper into the victims' relationships. Each suspect represented a potential loose thread in the fabric of this mystery, and Regina was determined to pull at each one until she unraveled the truth. With calculated calm, she began the interrogations, looking for inconsistencies, repressed emotions, or any detail that might reveal more than words alone could say. Everett Klein was a man who had built his reputation on shrewdness, ambition, and an almost supernatural knack for closing deals. At 48, he had become one of Gray Harbor's most influential lawyers, specializing in real estate and urban development. His name was synonymous with success in the town's business world, and his presence commanded respect wherever he went. He lived in a luxurious house by the harbor, a modern structure with large windows that reflected the calm waters of the sea. From his deck, he could watch the ships enter and leave the harbor, a constant reminder of his own ability to navigate the complexities of the real estate market. Everett had a clear vision for Gray Harbor. He wanted to transform it into an elite tourist destination, replacing small independent businesses like the Paper Compass with modern resorts, luxury boutiques, and exclusive restaurants. In his mind, this metamorphosis would not only benefit the town but also cement his legacy as the architect of a new chapter in Gray Harbor's history. However, there was one obstacle he wasn't willing to tolerate: Clara Ellsworth. Clara represented everything Everett considered an anachronism, a remnant of a past that no longer fit into his vision of the future. In recent months, Everett had tried multiple times to buy her property, offering increasingly generous sums to convince her. But Clara always rejected his offers, arguing that her bookstore was not for sale under any circumstances. This not only frustrated Everett, but also began to irritate him deeply. Clara not only refused to budge, she had also publicly threatened legal action if he continued to pressure her. Everett viewed that public statement as a direct challenge to his power, something he was unwilling to tolerate. When Detective Julia Hart arrived to question Everett, he appeared calm and self-possessed, as if he knew exactly how to handle the situation. Dressed in an impeccable suit and seated in his minimalist office, Everett claimed to have been at a gala dinner hosted by the town's Chamber of Commerce the night of the crime. Several people confirmed his presence at the event, but admitted that he left early, leaving a time window with no witnesses who could corroborate his movements afterward. Everett explained that he had decided to return home to review some important documents related to an upcoming project. but he could provide no conclusive evidence that he had actually been at his residence during that time. Detective Julia watched Everett closely as he spoke. It was evident that the lawyer was used to controlling situations, manipulating conversations to always favor his interests. However, Julia noticed something in his demeanor, an almost imperceptible tension that betrayed that, although he seemed relaxed, he was calculating every word he said. Everett was a man who knew how to move in the shadows, someone who understood the value of discretion and the power of influence. But he was also someone who did not tolerate resistance, especially when it came from someone like Clara, a woman who, from his perspective, had neither the right nor the authority to oppose his plans. Everett wasn't an impulsive man. Everything he did was carefully planned, from his choice of words to the gestures that accompanied his speeches. During questioning, he described his agenda for that evening in detail, mentioning names of people with whom he had interacted during dinner. However, when asked about his whereabouts after leaving the event, his response was vague, almost evasive. He explained that he had decided to take a walk around the harbor before returning home, but he couldn't specify how much time had passed or what route he had taken. Julia noticed that, although Everett seemed confident, there was a slight tremor in his hands when he mentioned the evening walk, as if he were trying to hide something. The lawyer also emphasized his relationship with Clara, insisting that despite their differences, he had never wanted to harm her. According to him, his interest in purchasing the paper compass was purely professional, a necessary step to move forward with his project. However, Julia couldn't help but wonder if his obsession with acquiring the property had crossed a line. Everett was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and Clara had been a thorn in his side for far too long. Had he reached the point of being cornered? Or perhaps his wounded pride had fueled a resentment that finally drove him to act. As Julia delved deeper into the investigation, she began to see Everett in a new light. He wasn't just an ambitious businessman. He was someone who lived and breathed power, someone who viewed any resistance as a personal affront. Clara's death, meticulously planned and executed, could perfectly fit the profile of someone like him. But Julia knew she needed more than suspicions and theories. She needed irrefutable evidence, something that connected Everett directly to the crime. Meanwhile, the lawyer remained a central figure in the investigation, a man whose ambition and determination might have taken him too far. Mabel Griggs, a 56-year-old woman, was known in Gray Harbor for her discretion and meticulousness. As president of the Gray Harbor Historical Club, she had dedicated much of her life to preserving the town's memory, ensuring that the secrets of the past remained intact, hidden beneath layers of time and dust. Mabel was a respected but distant figure, someone whose presence inspired both admiration and a certain discomfort. Her obsession with protecting the town's secrets wasn't just a passing interest. It was a mission she had embraced with almost religious fervor. For Mabel, the past wasn't something to be carelessly revealed. It was a fragile treasure that must be handled delicately to prevent the shadows of yesteryear from disturbing the present. Her relationship with Clara Ellsworth had long been one of mutual collaboration and professional respect. They shared a deep passion for history and were working together on a historical research project that sought to unravel the forgotten mysteries of Gray Harbor. However, that relationship had recently become strained due to irreconcilable differences over certain documents they had discovered. Clara insisted on publishing them, convinced that the truth must come out, while Mabel was determined to keep them hidden, fearing that their disclosure could expose uncomfortable secrets that would profoundly affect the town. For Mabel, those documents represented a latent threat, something that could upset the fragile balance that sustained life in Gray Harbor. The argument between the two women had quickly escalated into a fierce dispute that left open wounds and resentments. When Detective Julia Hart arrived to question Mabel, she appeared composed but visibly uncomfortable. Sitting in her study, surrounded by shelves filled with old books and meticulously organized folders, Mabel explained that she had been reviewing files at the public library that evening. Her voice was calm, but there was a defensive tone to her words, as if she knew every detail of her alibi would be scrutinized. The librarian confirmed that Mabel had been there late, immersed in her work, but admitted that no one else had been in the room when she decided to leave. This gap in her testimony left a window of time without witnesses, a blank space Julia couldn't ignore. Mabel was a woman who lived and breathed order. Everything in her life was structured with almost obsessive precision, from the way she organized her files to the way she planned her days. She valued control above all else, and any threat to that control unnerved her. During the interrogation, Julia noticed how Mabel avoided looking her directly in the eyes, instead focusing her attention on random spots in the room as she spoke. Her hands, though seemingly relaxed, constantly fiddled with the hem of her sweater, a gesture that suggested anxiety or discomfort. Although Mabel tried to project calm, there were small signs that something wasn't quite right. During the interrogation, Mabel made an effort to appear cooperative, offering specific details about her whereabouts that evening. She accurately described the documents she had been reviewing in the library, even mentioning some of the titles she had checked out. However, when asked about her departure from the library, her response was vague and unconvincing. She explained that she had decided to walk home, enjoying the fresh night air, but she was unable to provide a clear route or specify which route she had taken. Julia noticed that although Mabel tried to maintain a calm tone, her voice trembled slightly as she described her evening commute, as if she were ad-libbing as she spoke. As Julia continued to investigate, she began to see Mabel in a new light. She wasn't just a woman obsessed with protecting the past, she was someone who viewed any threat to her mission as a personal attack. Her meticulousness and need for control could have led her to act impulsively, especially if she felt Clara was about to cross a line she considered inviolable. Clara's death, executed with precision and deliberateness, fit the profile of someone like Mabel perfectly. Someone who planned every move carefully, someone who knew how to cover her tracks. But Julia knew she needed more than suspicions and coincidences. She needed evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mabel had been the perpetrator of the crime. Meanwhile, Mabel remained a central figure in the investigation, a woman whose obsession with the past might have led her too far. Julia couldn't rule out the possibility that night after leaving the library, Mabel had taken a different path, one that would lead her directly to the paper compass. Perhaps she had gone with the intention of confronting Clara once more, of convincing her to abandon her plan to publish the documents. Perhaps that confrontation had escalated quickly, ending in tragedy. Whatever the truth, Julia knew she must continue exploring every corner of Mabel's life, searching for the clues that would finally reveal what had really happened that night. Owen Drury was a 27-year-old whose life seemed to have taken an erratic turn in recent months. Previously, he had been an employee at the Paper Compass, where his easygoing attitude and sense of humor made him popular with the regular customers. However, over time, his behavior began to change. Behavioral issues that had once been subtle became more apparent. Late arrivals, arguments with co-workers, and a general lack of commitment to his work. Finally, 6 months ago, Clara Ellsworth, the bookstore owner, made the difficult decision to fire him. Since then, Owen had been working in disreputable bars around the harbor, temporary jobs that barely kept him afloat while he rapidly accumulated debt. Owen's resentment toward Clara grew over time, fueled by the feeling that she had ruined his job opportunities. He often publicly blamed her for his firing, claiming that she had treated him unfairly and left him scarred for future employers. According to him, Clara had intentionally blocked his job references, making it difficult for him to get steady work elsewhere. This feeling of injustice became an obsession, a constant source of frustration that drove him to make aggressive comments about her in public. In the bars where he worked or hung out, it was not uncommon to hear him speak badly of Clara, criticizing her character and accusing her of being too strict and ruthless. To those who knew him, Owen seemed to be struggling with something deeper than simple resentment. It was as if he were caught in a spiral of bitterness and self-destruction. When Detective Julia Hart arrived to interview Owen, he appeared nervous but tried to appear calm. He lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a modest accommodation that reflected his precarious situation. During the interrogation, he claimed he had been sleeping in his apartment the night of the crime, arguing that he had no way to prove it because he lived alone and no one was around to confirm his story. His alibi, although plausible, lacked hard evidence to support it, leaving a troubling gap in his testimony. Julia noticed how Owen avoided looking her directly in the eyes while speaking, focusing his attention on random spots in the room as if mentally searching for a way out of each awkward question. Owen was an impulsive man, someone who acted without considering the consequences. His life since his dismissal had been a cycle of hasty decisions and accumulated mistakes. The debts he had incurred with unethical lenders had him trapped in a web of constant pressure. These individuals were not known for their patience or compassion, and Owen knew he urgently needed money to avoid more serious retaliation. This combination of factors, resentment toward Clara, mounting debts, and desperation, placed him in a vulnerable position. Julia couldn't ignore the possibility that Owen had seen Clara as a quick fix for his problems, perhaps considering that a confrontation with her might force her to give him money or some kind of compensation. During the interrogation, Owen attempted to justify his recent behavior, explaining how circumstances had led him to make poor choices. He spoke of the temporary jobs he had taken, the endless days in smoky bars with loud music, and how he had lost hope of ever finding anything better. However, when asked specifically about his relationship with Clara, his tone changed. His previously calm voice took on a defensive, almost defiant tone. He insisted that he held no ill will toward her beyond what he had already expressed publicly, but Julia noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, as if he were struggling to maintain control of his emotions. Detective Julia knew Owen had clear motives for wanting to confront Clara. Accumulated resentment combined with his desperate financial situation could have led him to act impulsively. Furthermore, his prior access to the bookstore and his familiarity with the premises made him someone who could navigate the space without raising immediate suspicion. However, Julia was also aware that she couldn't base her conclusions solely on assumptions. She needed concrete evidence connecting Owen to the crime, something that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had been involved. As she continued to investigate, Julia began to see Owen in a new light. He wasn't just an unemployed young man with behavioral issues. He was someone caught in a personal storm of resentment and despair. His life since the dismissal had been a series of constant falls, with each obstacle seeming to push him closer to the abyss. Clara's death, executed with precision and deliberateness, didn't entirely fit the profile of someone impulsive like Owen, but that didn't mean he was innocent. Perhaps he had gone to the bookstore that night intending to confront Clara, demanding money or some form of reparation. Perhaps that confrontation had escalated quickly, ending in tragedy. Whatever the truth, Julia knew she must continue exploring every corner of Owen's life, searching for the clues that would finally reveal what had really happened that night. Owen remained a central figure in the investigation, a man whose resentment and desperation might have driven him too far. Julia couldn't rule out the possibility that that night, after claiming to be sleeping in her apartment, Owen had slipped out unnoticed, heading straight for the paper compass. Perhaps he had gone with the intention of speaking to Clara, to demand something he felt he owed her. Perhaps that conversation had taken a fatal turn. Meanwhile, Julia continued to piece together the puzzle, searching for the truth amid the shadows of the past and the darkest human emotions. After weeks of exhaustive investigation, the case took an unexpected turn when investigators delved deeper into the analysis of the chemical found near Clara's body. This compound, commonly used in the restoration of antique books, was not available to the general public and required access to specialized tools and materials. This led detectives to focus their attention on Mabel Griggs, who possessed the chemical in her personal workshop as part of her job at the Gray Harbor Historical Club. The connection between the substance and Mabel was the first solid clue that began to weave an incriminating web around her. Under intense pressure and faced with increasingly overwhelming evidence, Mabel finally relented and confessed to the murder of Clara Ellsworth. Her motivation, she explained, was to protect secrets that had remained buried for decades. Clara had discovered documents revealing historical criminal acts committed by several prominent families in town, including Mabel's own. These compromising documents threatened to expose uncomfortable truths that could destroy reputations and forever alter the perception of Gray Harbor. For Mabel, the disclosure of these secrets not only represented a threat to the established order, but also a betrayal of her mission to protect the town's past. The murder was executed coldly and meticulously. Mabel waited patiently until the bookstore had closed and everyone had left. Then, using a copy of the keys Clara had previously given her to facilitate her collaboration on the historical research project, she stealthily entered, confronted Clara at the counter, and tried one last time to persuade her to abandon her plans to publish the documents. When Clara adamantly refused, Mabel acted with precision, stabbing her repeatedly with a knife she had carried specifically for this purpose. The crime was not impulsive. Every move had been carefully planned, from the use of the knife to the meticulous disposal of the body after the attack. Mabel tried to fake a robbery or an act of vandalism to divert suspicion, but her obsession with leaving a message ended up being her biggest mistake. She nailed a page torn from an old book to the wall with the same knife used in the crime, believing this detail might distract investigators or send a cryptic message that no one would understand. She also planted the blood-stained screwdriver at the scene as a red herring, thinking it would reinforce the idea of a violent intruder. However, forensic analysis quickly proved that the screwdriver belonged to her personal workshop, directly linking her to the crime. The key to solving the case was the combination of physical and psychological evidence. Chemical analysis connected Mabel to the crime scene, while her psychological profile revealed clear signs of extreme paranoia and an almost compulsive obsession with protecting the town's secrets. Her arrogance and need for control led her to make mistakes that, though subtle, were enough to unravel her carefully crafted plan. Ultimately, it was her own ego that betrayed her, exposing not only the crime but also the shadows she had tried so long to hide. The trial of Mabel Griggs became the most talked-about event in Gray Harbor's recent history. During the hearings, details of the crime and the dark secrets that motivated the murder came to light, shaking the town to its core. Mabel, always composed and meticulous, tried to maintain an appearance of innocence, but forensic evidence and her prior confession left little room for doubt. The court determined that she acted with malice aforethought, using her privileged access to the bookstore and her knowledge of Clara to commit the crime. Mabel was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, the judge emphasized that her obsession with protecting the secrets of the past had resulted in an irreversible act of violence that not only took Clara's life, but also fractured the community's trust. As a result of the case, the historical documents Clara had attempted to reveal were taken into state custody, ensuring that they were examined and disclosed ethically. The trial also brought significant changes to Gray Harbor. The families involved in the exposed secrets faced public scrutiny, creating lasting tensions in the town. For many, the case served as a grim reminder of the destructive power of secrets and how the obsession with controlling the past can corrupt even those sworn to protect it. Mabel, once admired for her dedication to history, was reduced to a symbol of betrayal and manipulation, while Clara was remembered as a tireless defender of the truth. Case 3. Lake Tahoe stretched out like a dark mirror under an overcast sky, its calm waters reflecting the gray clouds that seemed to portend something more somber than a simple storm. On the lake's most exclusive shore, where mansions competed in luxury and opulence, stood an imposing estate, a modern-style mansion with wide windows overlooking the water, perfectly manicured gardens, and an air of mystery that only the wealthy could afford. This was the residence of the Whitakers, a family whose name had been synonymous with power and wealth for generations. But that day, the mansion's usual calm was interrupted by piercing screams that echoed in the cold October air. A housekeeper, whose job that morning was to clean the master bedroom, opened the bathroom door and found herself in a scene that left her paralyzed. Jonathan Whitaker, the family patriarch, lay motionless inside a white marble bathtub, his body partially submerged in lukewarm water that was already beginning to cool. The visible burns on his hands and neck were clear signs of electrocution, but what shocked the woman most was the absolute stillness of the place. There were no signs of panic or struggle, only silence, as if death itself had chosen this moment to make its triumphant entrance. The housekeeper's screams quickly attracted the attention of nearby neighbors, who called the authorities just minutes later. When the first officers arrived on the scene, the atmosphere was heavy, almost unreal. The dim light from a hanging lamp dimly illuminated the bathroom, casting long shadows on the polished marble walls. Inside the bathtub, a hairdryer was plugged in, its electrical cord neatly severed near the outlet, as if someone had used precise tools to manipulate it. This detail did not go unnoticed by investigators, who began to suspect that something darker and more calculated lay behind what, at first glance, might have seemed like a tragic domestic accident. On the floor next to the bathtub, a small piece of black cloth was found that didn't match any of the victim's clothing. It was a subtle clue, but enough to pique the detective's curiosity. Furthermore, on a glass side table next to the bathtub were a half-empty bottle of wine and 2 used glasses, one of them still with liquid residue at the bottom. This discovery raised a crucial question. Had Jonathan Whitaker been with someone that night? If so, where was that person now? The place was impeccably tidy, as if someone had taken the time to ensure everything was in its place before leaving. The meticulousness of the crime contrasted with the brutality of its outcome, creating a contrast that made the case even more intriguing. That's when Detective Liam Harper arrived, a middle-aged man with a legendary reputation at the Nevada Police Department. Harper was known for his ability to solve the most complex cases, those that others had given up as impossible. His presence at a crime scene always brought with it a mix of hope and tension. While some trusted his ability to find answers, others feared what he might uncover. Dressed in a dark suit and with an impassive expression, Harper slowly walked around the bathroom, absorbing every detail with trained eyes. He noted the hairdryer, the severed cord, the black fabric, the wine glasses. Everything seemed too perfect, too planned to be a random accident. Harper knew that the smallest details often held the biggest clues. He paused in front of the bathtub, gazing down at the lifeless body of Jonathan Whitaker. There was something about the victim's posture that caught his attention, a kind of relaxation that belied the violence of his death. It seemed as if Jonathan had been enjoying a quiet moment, oblivious to what was about to happen. But someone had intervened. Someone had decided that this peaceful moment would end abruptly and definitively. As forensic technicians began collecting evidence, Harper promised himself he would find out who had been behind this carefully orchestrated death. Lake Tahoe held secrets, and he was determined to unearth every one of them. Jonathan Edward Whitaker was a man whose life seemed woven between dazzling success and the shadows of a complex personality. At 47, he had built a real estate empire from scratch, becoming one of the most influential businessmen in the American Southwest. His ambition knew no bounds, and his controlling nature had led him to achieve goals many considered unattainable. However, that same determination had also earned him enemies, especially in recent months, when lawsuits surfaced accusing him of fraudulent practices in several business transactions. These rumors began to erode his reputation and sow doubt even among his closest circles. Personally, Jonathan was a lover of luxury and enjoyed surrounding himself with beauty. His contemporary art collection was one of the most prized in exclusive circles, and his mansion by Lake Tahoe was the perfect setting for the parties he frequently hosted. But behind that glittering facade, his marriage to Regina Whitaker, 43, was at a crossroads. Jonathan's frequent absences and distant attitude had created an unbridgeable rift between them. Furthermore, rumors of infidelity began to circulate among his acquaintances, although they were never publicly confirmed. Detective Liam Harper, a man of imposing presence and penetrating gaze, prepared to begin the interrogations with his characteristic calculated calm. With years of experience unraveling the most complex cases, he knew that every word, every gesture could reveal more than it appeared. Sitting across from the first person of interest, he carefully organized his notes, adjusted his dark tie, and adopted a relaxed but firm posture. His calm, professional tone was designed to gain the trust of those in front of him, although his intention was always the same: to get to the truth. Regina Whitaker was a woman whose life seemed the epitome of privilege and sophistication, but beneath that impeccable exterior lay emotional scars that had accumulated over the years. At 43, Regina came from a wealthy family in Southern California, where she had grown up surrounded by luxury and expectations. Her marriage to Jonathan Whitaker, celebrated 20 years earlier, had begun like a modern fairy tale. They met at an art auction where their immediate connection was evident to all present. At the time, Jonathan was an emerging entrepreneur with grand ambitions, and Regina, young and radiant, seemed like the perfect partner to accompany him on his rise to success. However, what initially seemed like a harmonious relationship soon began to show irreparable cracks. The arrival of their children, Clara and Thomas, marked a turning point in their marriage. Although they shared a life of luxury and comfort, the birth of the children seemed to shift Jonathan's attention toward his career and personal interests. Regina, who had always been an independent and self-confident woman, began to feel relegated to the background. Conversations between them became rare and arguments more frequent. Over time, Regina began to notice troubling changes in Jonathan's behavior, unexplained absences, financial decisions he didn't discuss with her, and persistent rumors of infidelity floating around the social circles they frequented. Each of these details fueled her frustration and mistrust, slowly eroding the foundation of their marriage. Recently, during a family gathering, Regina had openly expressed her dissatisfaction with the relationship. She didn't do so with shouting or tears, but with a coldness that reflected years of pent-up resentment. She spoke of how Jonathan had emotionally manipulated her, how he had used his position of power to control not only her professional life, but also her personal life. Regina knew that Jonathan was transferring assets into offshore accounts, likely in an attempt to protect his fortune from future legal or personal problems. This filled her with dread, as it meant that if he ever decided to get a divorce, she could lose not only her lifestyle, but also the financial stability she valued so much. For Regina, the idea of initiating a divorce was tantamount to facing an uncertain future filled with public scandals. It was a prospect she couldn't bear. When the night of the crime arrived, Regina claimed to be sleeping alone in another room, unaware of what had happened in the marble bathtub in the master bedroom. According to her testimony, she had retired early due to a mild headache and hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. However, her alibi lacked witnesses to back it up. The domestic employees had already left for their off-site living quarters, and her children were sleeping in another wing of the mansion, too far away to have noticed anything unusual. This lack of confirmation left investigators with more questions than answers. Was it possible that Regina had been so sound asleep that she hadn't noticed any suspicious noises or movements? Or, on the contrary, was her statement a careful construction to conceal her involvement in the events of that night? Detective Liam Harper observed Regina during her interrogation with a mixture of curiosity and caution. It was clear that Jonathan's wife was no ordinary woman. Her elegant bearing and manner of speech reflected years of practice in maintaining an impeccable public image. However, Harper also detected something else beneath that facade, an almost imperceptible tension in the way she crossed her legs or played with the hem of her scarf. It was as if she were trying to control every aspect of her behavior, making sure she didn't reveal anything that might compromise her. Harper knew that people like Regina, accustomed to moving in circles of power and money, were adept at hiding their true emotions. But he also knew that even the most skilled actors could make mistakes, especially when the weight of their actions began to weigh on their conscience. As he reviewed the details of the case, Harper couldn't help but reflect on the impact Jonathan's death would have on Regina. On the one hand, her financial position would be secured, as the Whitaker fortune would pass directly to her and her children, without the threat of hidden assets or future lawsuits. On the other hand, the detective couldn't ignore the possibility that Regina had been acting out of years of pent-up resentment. The idea of eliminating Jonathan would not only solve her financial problems, but also allow her to free herself from a relationship that, in her own words, had long since ceased to make sense. However, Harper knew that these theories required solid evidence, and so far Regina had managed to maintain an unshakable appearance of innocence. As the case progressed, Regina Whitaker's name remained a key focus. Every detail, every contradiction in her testimony was meticulously analyzed by the investigative team. Although there wasn't yet enough evidence to directly link her to the crime, Harper didn't rule out the possibility that Regina was harboring secrets that could change the course of the investigation forever. Marcus Langley, 39, was a man who had built a solid reputation as a corporate lawyer in Reno's business circles. His career was marked by significant successes and an innate ability to navigate the complexities of corporate law. He was meticulous, intelligent, and strategic, qualities that had made him the ideal business partner for Jonathan Whitaker. For years, Marcus had been the mastermind behind many of the financial and legal structures that allowed Jonathan to expand his real estate empire. The two shared not only professional interests, but also personal hobbies such as golf and art collecting, which had led them to forge a close relationship that transcended the strictly professional. Recently, however, that friendship began to show irreparable cracks, the result of tensions that went beyond simple differences of opinion. The dispute between Marcus and Jonathan revolved around one of their most ambitious joint projects, a real estate investment that promised extraordinary returns, but, for reasons still unknown, ended up being a monumental failure. Marcus felt that Jonathan had betrayed him by withholding key information about the project's true financial health, leaving him exposed to other investors and business partners. This lack of transparency not only threatened to ruin his professional reputation, but could also have led to him facing multi-million-dollar lawsuits that could have devastated his career. For Marcus, Jonathan's betrayal was not only a blow to his confidence, but a direct threat to his future. Every time he thought about how Jonathan had used him as a pawn in that financial game, he felt a mixture of rage and helplessness slowly consume him. Detective Liam Harper observed Marcus closely during the interrogation. At first glance, Marcus seemed the epitome of a successful professional. Impeccable suit, controlled expression, and a confident demeanor. However, Harper knew that appearances could be deceiving, and something about Marcus's avoidance of certain topics caught his attention. According to his testimony, Marcus claimed to have been working late in his Reno office on the night of the crime, reviewing documents related to another important case. Several security cameras confirmed that his car had left the building's parking lot around 11:30 p.m., which seemed to corroborate his story. However, the problem lay in the time period between midnight and 2 a.m., the very time Jonathan Whitaker was estimated to have lost his life in his luxurious bathtub. During that crucial time, there was no conclusive evidence to prove exactly where Marcus had been. Harper knew that this gap in Marcus's alibi was enough to keep him on the suspect list. Although the lawyer seemed genuinely concerned about solving the case and was cooperating with authorities, his connection to Jonathan and the recent conflict between the two made his position delicate. Furthermore, Marcus had access to privileged information about Jonathan's personal and professional life, placing him in a unique position to plan such a carefully orchestrated crime. The detective couldn't ignore the possibility that Marcus had taken advantage of his knowledge of Jonathan's routines, as well as his close relationship with him, to carry out a vengeful act that would free him from the threat posed by his former partner. Financial reports and statements from other business partners revealed that Marcus had been pressuring Jonathan for clear answers about the failed project. His emails and text messages displayed an increasingly aggressive, even desperate tone, suggesting that Marcus was on the verge of losing his emotional control. While this didn't necessarily prove his guilt, it was clear that Marcus had a powerful motive for wanting to get rid of Jonathan. Eliminating him would not only allow him to avoid future lawsuits and protect his reputation, but would also send a clear message to any other potential partners who might try to betray him. However, Harper also knew that accusing someone like Marcus required irrefutable evidence. So far, all they had were coincidences and theories. The fact that Marcus was an experienced lawyer probably meant he knew how to cover his tracks if he had actually committed a crime. His testimony was carefully crafted, and his demeanor during cross-examination showed no signs of excessive nervousness or obvious inconsistencies. But Harper didn't rule out the possibility that Marcus was playing a role, using his legal expertise to anticipate the detective's questions and prepare answers that would exonerate him. Marcus remained a central figure in the investigation. His relationship with Jonathan, his financial conflict, and his lack of an alibi at the exact time of the crime kept him under the scrutiny of the authorities. Harper knew that, although Marcus seemed to have every reason to commit the crime, key pieces were still missing that could directly connect him to Jonathan's death. Meanwhile, the lawyer continued to maintain his innocence, maintaining a calm and professional demeanor that, rather than dispelling suspicions, seemed to reinforce them. In the world of business and betrayal, Marcus Langley was a seasoned player, and Harper was determined to discover if he was also a killer. Victoria Hartwell, at just 28 years old, was a figure who represented the ambitious and creative spirit of emerging artists. Her talent for capturing emotions on vibrant canvases had caught the attention of exclusive circles in the art world, but she was still far from achieving the international recognition she so longed for. She was a young, passionate, and charismatic woman, with an energy that attracted those around her. However, behind her captivating smile and carefree demeanor, Victoria hid boundless ambition and a fragile sensitivity that made her vulnerable to disappointment. Her relationship with Jonathan Whitaker was a clear example of how her personal aspirations could become dangerously intertwined with dynamics of power and control. Jonathan had been a pivotal patron for Victoria since discovering her work in a small local gallery. He was the one who propelled her into the elite art world, promoting her creations to influential collectors and funding some of her most important exhibitions. However, their relationship went beyond the professional. According to persistent rumors, Jonathan and Victoria maintained a close connection, although it was never publicly confirmed. Regina Whitaker, always perceptive and jealous of anyone who got too close to her husband, deeply distrusted Victoria. Jonathan's wife saw her not only as a protected artist, but also as a threat to their already deteriorating marriage. Witnesses claimed that Victoria visited the mansion frequently, even at night, further fueling speculation about the nature of her relationship with Jonathan. However, the relationship between Victoria and Jonathan began to change when he informed her that he could no longer invest in her career. According to Jonathan, financial problems and legal demands forced him to reduce his support for personal projects, including Victoria's. For her, this news was devastating. She felt that Jonathan had betrayed her, abandoning her just when she most needed his support to make the leap to international success. In her mind, everything she had built up to that point Her reputation, her self-confidence, depended on Jonathan's continued support. His rejection not only represented a professional obstacle, but also an emotional rupture that left her feeling used and discarded. This mixture of frustration and resentment began to slowly consume her, fueling dark thoughts that could have led her to consider revenge as her only solution. When Detective Liam Harper questioned Victoria, she claimed to have been at a local bar drinking with friends on the night of the crime. According to her account, she had spent several hours in the company of close friends, enjoying a relaxing evening. However, one of those friends later admitted that Victoria had left the premises early without explanation. This detail contradicted her initial alibi and opened a crucial gap in her testimony. Harper knew that these kinds of inconsistencies were clues that couldn't be ignored. Furthermore, the fact that Victoria was a regular visitor to the mansion and had access to the property raised uncomfortable questions about her possible involvement in the crime. Harper watched Victoria closely during the interrogation. Although she tried to maintain a relaxed demeanor, there were times when her nervousness seeped into small gestures. She played with her hair, avoided looking directly at him, or hesitated before answering certain questions. These details, though subtle, were enough to pique the detective's curiosity. Victoria had a clear motive for wanting to get rid of Jonathan, to eliminate the man she believed had ruined her dreams and betrayed her trust. Furthermore, her access to the mansion and her knowledge of Jonathan's routines placed her in a prime position to plan such a carefully executed crime. As Harper delved deeper into the investigation, she began analyzing past interactions between Victoria and Jonathan. The recovered text messages and emails revealed a complex relationship, fraught with emotional ups and downs. At times, Jonathan seemed genuinely interested in supporting Victoria's talents, while at others he adopted a distant, practical tone, as if gradually trying to distance himself from her. For Victoria, these conflicting signals had likely intensified her sense of abandonment. While this didn't prove her guilt, it did suggest that her bond with Jonathan was far from stable or predictable. The detective also considered the impact Jonathan's death would have on Victoria's life. Eliminating him would not only remove the source of her frustration, but could also open up new opportunities for her. As an artist associated with such an influential man, her name would remain linked to Jonathan's even after his death, potentially increasing interest in her work. Furthermore, if she could distance herself from any suspicion, Victoria could leverage the scandal to position herself as a victim of fate, gaining sympathy and media attention. Despite these theories, Harper knew that accusing Victoria required hard evidence. So far, all they had were coincidences and assumptions. Her youth and apparent emotional fragility might lead some to underestimate her, but Harper wasn't making that mistake. He knew that people capable of extreme acts often hide their intentions behind innocent masks. As he continued to investigate, Victoria's name remained a major focus of attention. Her ambition, her resentment, and her lack of a solid alibi made her a central figure in the puzzle the detective was determined to solve. Danny Monroe was a 50-year-old man whose life had been marked by routine and constant work. For the past 15 years, he had been the gardener and trusted employee of the Whitakers, a family whose name resonated with power and opulence throughout Lake Tahoe. Danny was known for his discretion and loyalty. He never interfered in the family's personal affairs or shared details about their private lives. His dedication to maintaining the mansion's gardens was impeccable, and his calm, efficient presence had made him an almost invisible figure within the estate. However, in recent months, something had changed within him. He had begun to show signs of resentment, small gestures that revealed a growing frustration. He sighed more than usual, avoided eye contact with Jonathan when he gave him instructions, and occasionally seemed distracted, as if he were dealing with problems that went beyond work. The reason for his change of heart wasn't difficult to identify. The constant delays in his payments had begun to affect his financial stability. Danny not only depended on that job to support himself, but also to cover his family's basic needs. Jonathan's threat to fire him if he didn't improve his work performance had been the final blow. For Danny, losing that job would mean much more than losing his income. It would mean facing an uncertain future, with no solid references to find another job in a competitive market. Furthermore, the debts he had accumulated with dubious lenders added a layer of despair to his situation. These lenders weren't known for their patience or ethical methods, and Danny knew that not paying on time could have serious consequences for both him and his family. With each passing day, his stress increased, and his mind began to race with how to break out of this spiral of financial hardship. When Detective Liam Harper questioned Danny, he claimed to have been fixing a leak in the backyard irrigation system throughout the night of the crime. According to his testimony, he had spent hours working by the light of a portable lantern, focused on solving the problem before dawn. However, something in his statement raised suspicions among investigators. No one had seen him directly while he worked, and when they checked his tools, they noticed they were covered in fresh dirt, as if they had been used recently, but not throughout the night. This detail contradicted his version of events and raised awkward questions about his exact whereabouts at the time of Jonathan's death. Harper observed Danny during the interrogation with a mixture of curiosity and caution. At first glance, he seemed to be the epitome of a loyal employee, a quiet, hard-working, and seemingly harmless man. However, the detective knew that people who led seemingly simple lives often harbored complex secrets. Danny had full access to the property, including the master bedroom where Jonathan's body was found. Furthermore, his knowledge of the family's routines placed him in a prime position to plan such a meticulously executed crime. Harper also considered the emotional impact the threat of dismissal might have had on Danny. For someone already on the brink of financial collapse, eliminating Jonathan would not only solve his financial problems but also prevent future conflicts with his employer. As Harper delved deeper into the investigation, she began to analyze the details of Danny's personal life. The debts he had incurred with unreliable lenders suggested he was desperate for a quick way out of his situation. Furthermore, his recent behavior showed signs of emotional exhaustion and accumulated stress. It was possible Danny had reached a breaking point, where the fear of losing everything overcame any moral inhibitions. The detective couldn't ignore the possibility that Danny had used his access to the mansion and his knowledge of Jonathan's routines to commit an impulsive but calculated act. Eliminating Jonathan would not only free him from the threat of dismissal, but might also allow him access to some form of financial compensation, either through insurance or subsequent legal settlements. However, Harper also knew that accusing someone like Danny required irrefutable evidence. So far, all they had were coincidences and theories. His alibi, however inconsistent, wasn't enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Furthermore, Danny was a man who had spent 15 years proving his loyalty to the Whitaker family, making his involvement in the crime seem unlikely at first glance. But Harper didn't rule out the possibility that even the most discreet people could commit extreme acts when cornered by untenable circumstances. After weeks of exhaustive investigation, Detective Liam Harper finally managed to unravel the mystery surrounding Jonathan Whitaker's death. The case had been a complex puzzle, filled with misleading clues and suspects with plausible motivations. However, it was a seemingly insignificant detail that led Harper to the truth: the small fragment of black cloth found at the crime scene. This piece of fabric, almost overlooked in initial analyses, turned out to be a perfect match for the uniform worn by Danny Monroe, the Whitaker family's gardener. But that wasn't all. Forensic analysis of the hairdryer, the improvised weapon used in the crime, revealed fingerprints that unequivocally belonged to Danny. These two pieces of evidence, though subtle, were enough to tip the balance. When Danny was confronted with this irrefutable evidence, his facade of innocence began to crumble. At first, he tried to deny everything, but the pressure of the mounting evidence led him to admit his guilt. Finally, he confessed to having meticulously planned the murder, taking advantage of the tensions between Jonathan and Marcus Langley to shift suspicion to others. His strategy was clear: create a scene that looked like a common domestic accident, eliminating any hint of premeditation or criminal intent. Danny knew that Jonathan often relaxed by taking long baths after his exhausting days, and he decided to use this habit against him. He waited patiently until all the domestic staff had retired to their off-site living quarters and stealthily entered the master bedroom while Jonathan enjoyed a peaceful soak. Danny's method was both ingenious and simple, designed to go unnoticed at first glance. He carefully cut the hairdryer's cord near the plug, ensuring the cut looked like a common technical malfunction. He then strategically placed the appliance on the edge of the bathtub, where he knew it would fall into the water when Jonathan leaned forward. His knowledge of the household's routines and unrestricted access to the property allowed him to execute his plan without raising immediate suspicion. To cover his tracks, he painstakingly cleaned any surfaces he might have touched during the crime, demonstrating an attention to detail that almost made him go unnoticed. However, his effort to erase evidence was not perfect. The fragment of black cloth got caught in the door frame and his fingerprints remained on the hairdryer, mistakes that ultimately gave him away. Danny acted out of financial desperation and fear of losing his job. He knew Jonathan was considering firing him due to alleged deficiencies in his work performance, a threat that would have left Danny without income or references to find another job. Furthermore, the significant debts he had incurred with dubious lenders sent him into a constant state of panic. In his mind, eliminating Jonathan would not only solve his financial problems, but also prevent future conflicts with his employer. Although he had never shown signs of violence before, the extreme circumstances led him to make a drastic decision. The resolution of the case served as a powerful reminder that even the most carefully planned crimes can be uncovered with attention to detail and meticulous police work. Detective Harper emphasized that, although Danny had attempted to erase all evidence, small mistakes like the piece of cloth and the fingerprints ended up being crucial in solving the mystery. Furthermore, the case underscored the importance of analyzing every clue, no matter how insignificant it may seem, as it is often these details that lead to the truth. Danny Monroe's trial was an event that attracted the attention of the local community and regional media. During the proceedings, the evidence presented by the prosecution, including the piece of black cloth and the fingerprints on the hairdryer, left little room for doubt. Danny attempted to argue that he had acted under extreme financial pressure and fear of losing everything, but his defense failed to convince the jury that he deserved mercy. Ultimately, he was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing marked the final closure of a case that had deeply shaken the Whitaker family and everyone involved. For Regina and her children, the resolution of the case brought some peace, although the emotional wounds would remain for a long time. The mansion by Lake Tahoe, once a symbol of luxury and opulence, now seemed to carry with it an atmosphere of melancholy. The neighbors, silent witnesses to the events, gradually returned to their routines, although the scars of the case remained present in occasional conversations. For Detective Liam Harper, this case reaffirmed his faith in the power of meticulous investigation and the importance of not underestimating any detail. Although Lake Tahoe regained its apparent tranquility, the echoes of the tragedy reminded everyone that even in the most idyllic places, the shadows of the human heart can manifest in unexpected ways. Case 4. New York's Grand Central Terminal is more than a train station. It's a temple of movement and time, a place where dreams and goodbyes intertwine beneath a ceiling painted with golden constellations. Every morning, thousands of people pass through its majestic arches and hallways, often ignoring the grandeur that surrounds them as they rush toward their destinations. But on that winter morning, something broke the relentless routine of this historic landmark, something dark and unexpected. At 6:45 a.m., as the sun was just beginning to filter through the tall glass windows, a cleaning employee noticed something out of the ordinary. A strong, pungent smell, like that of industrial chemicals, wafted through the air. Following the trail, he discovered a body lying on one of the varnished wooden benches located in the heart of the main hall. The man lay motionless, a shocked expression frozen on his face. At first glance, there were no obvious signs of violence. His clothing was immaculate, with no visible tears or stains, but upon closer inspection, the employee noticed something disturbing: small burns on the deceased's hands and lips. Horrified, the employee alerted terminal security, who promptly called the police. The scene soon became a nexus of controlled chaos. Grand Central Terminal security officers swept the area, clearing curious onlookers and ensuring no one touched anything. The police arrived soon after, followed by the forensics team. Prominent among them was Detective Oliver William, a veteran of the force known as much for his meticulousness as for his unerring intuition. Tall, with gray hair flecked with black, William had a peculiar way of observing every detail, as if he could read between invisible lines. With a calm but determined stride, he approached the body, his eyes slowly scanning the scene. There was something in the air that made his skin crawl, a feeling that this wasn't just any ordinary crime. The body, later identified as Evan Thorne, a 37-year-old environmental engineer, appeared to have been deliberately placed on that bench, as if someone wanted him found quickly. There were no signs of a struggle, and his posture was almost serene, making the cause of death even more puzzling. Nearby, several objects caught William's attention. First, a water bottle of unknown brand discarded a few feet away. Inside, residue of a clear liquid that, upon preliminary analysis, revealed mixtures of diluted bleach. Then a torn train ticket, destined for Boston, which appeared to have been ripped out in fury. And finally, a small tree-shaped keychain, abandoned on the floor next to the body. This last object seemed out of place, too personal to belong in a place as impersonal as a train waiting room. William knew that every detail told a story, and there were many stories here waiting to be deciphered. Why had they left those objects? What did they mean? And why would anyone choose to kill in such a public, crowded place? Grand Central Terminal never truly slept, even at this early hour. Dozens of people passed by every minute, and yet no one had seen or heard a thing. It was as if the killer had planned everything carefully, playing on the trust the crowd placed in the anonymity of the mob. As technicians collected evidence and documented every corner of the scene, William walked slowly around the body, absorbing every detail. He observed the painted ceiling above him, the gold stars glowing dimly in the artificial light. He thought about how many lives crossed this space daily, all connected in some way, even if most had never met. Here in the midst of this architectural marvel, a man had met his end in a brutal and calculated way. William stopped in front of the bench where Evan Thorne lay, his gaze fixed on the deceased's face. There was something about that shocked expression that deeply unsettled him. It wasn't just the shock of death, but something more, as if Evan had recognized his killer just before he drew his last breath. The investigation was just beginning, but William already felt the pressure of the clock. He knew that every second that passed brought the culprit further away from them. However, he also knew that the key to solving the case lay in the details, in the seemingly insignificant clues that others might miss. With a deep sigh, he turned to his team and gestured for them to continue. This case would be different. He felt it in his bones. And as Grand Central Terminal continued to churn around him, William knew his work had only just begun. Evan Thorne, 37, was a prominent environmental engineer in the field of renewable energy. Originally from Portland, Oregon, he was the only son of Margaret and Harold Thorne, both retired. From a young age, Evan displayed an inclination toward science and nature, which led him to graduate summa cum laude from Stanford University. For over a decade, he worked for leading green technology companies before founding his own consulting firm, Thorne Renewables, specializing in innovative clean energy projects. Professionally, Evan was admired for his brilliance and tireless dedication to environmental causes. He traveled constantly between major cities in the United States, participating in conferences and overseeing key projects. Despite his success, he maintained a private, personal life. Single and childless, he preferred to focus on his career and hobbies, such as landscape photography, a passion that reflected his love for the environment. In recent weeks, some close friends noticed a change in him. He seemed troubled, though he never revealed the reasons. His parents also observed that his usual phone calls had become brief and distant. With no criminal record or significant legal conflicts, Evan seemed to lead a blameless life. However, months before his death, he had received anonymous threats after exposing financial irregularities at a contracting company linked to one of his projects. This fact raised the possibility that his murder was related to workplace retaliation. Although his public life was filled with achievements, his private life remained enigmatic until the very end. Who Evan Thorne was in his final days remains a mystery, but his legacy as a defender of the planet lives on in those who shared his vision and commitment to a sustainable future. With the first clues gathered at the crime scene, Detective Oliver William decided it was time to delve deeper into Evan Thorne's possible personal and professional connections. Every object found had a story to tell, and every relationship the victim had could hide a secret. It was time to confront those who knew Evan, exploring their motivations, grudges, or awkward silences. The interrogations would be crucial to unraveling the truth behind his tragic end. The investigation was progressing, but many questions still remained unanswered. Caleb Ormsby, a 42-year-old man with an intense gaze and a posture that denoted both pride and weariness, was a central figure in the investigation into Evan Thorne's murder. His connection with the victim wasn't superficial. In fact, Caleb had been the original co-founder of Thorne Renewables, the consulting firm that now bore only Evan's name. However, their association didn't end on good terms. Years earlier, a legal dispute over intellectual property rights led to Caleb's expulsion from the company he had helped create. Since then, his professional life had taken a very different, though no less ambitious direction. After his forced departure from Thorn Renewables, Caleb attempted to forge his own path as an independent entrepreneur specializing in alternative energy. However, his career path fell far short of the success and recognition Evan had achieved. While Thorn established himself as an influential figure in the industry, Caleb struggled to stay afloat in a competitive market. Rumors circulated about his financial difficulties, with some even suggesting he was on the verge of bankruptcy. This situation had turned him into a bitter man, resentful not only of Evan but also of the system that, he believed, had left him behind. Detective Elliot Grayson knew that human emotions, especially resentment, could be powerful drivers of extreme actions. During the interrogation, Caleb was one of the first suspects called to testify. Sitting across from Grayson, his demeanor was defensive but controlled, as if he had anticipated every question and carefully prepared his answers. Caleb made no secret of his bitterness toward Evan, openly admitting that he felt he had been betrayed. According to him, Evan had exploited their shared ideas to build an empire while ostracizing him. His words were laced with frustration, but also with a certain calculated coldness that gave the detective pause. William listened attentively as Caleb recounted his side of the story. According to him, his relationship with Evan had initially been cordial, based on mutual respect and a shared passion for renewable energy. However, everything changed when differences arose over the company's direction. Caleb claimed that Evan had manipulated documents and legal agreements to sideline him, misappropriating concepts the two had developed together. This account coincided with some rumors William had heard during the investigation, but hard evidence to confirm these allegations was still lacking. What was clear was that Caleb harbored a deep resentment toward his former partner. In addition to his professional conflict, Caleb was facing personal problems that made him even more vulnerable as a suspect. His precarious financial situation was well known in his inner circle. Some colleagues mentioned that he had publicly expressed his desire for revenge against those he held responsible for his failure. For Caleb, Evan not only represented a personal betrayal but also an insurmountable obstacle to his career. In his mind, eliminating Evan could be seen as a way to regain some control over his destiny. However, Caleb vehemently denied any involvement in the crime, arguing that he had a solid alibi. According to his statements, Caleb had been engaged in a virtual meeting from his Brooklyn office between 5 and 7 a.m., right around the estimated time of the murder. Several people confirmed seeing him online during that time, although none could physically verify his location. This left room for doubt. Was it possible that Caleb had arranged his alibi in advance, using technology to his advantage to simulate his presence at the meeting? William knew that such strategies were not uncommon in premeditated murder cases, especially when the suspect had the resources and intelligence to plan every detail. Beyond his official statement, Caleb projected an intriguing mix of emotions during the interrogation. At times, he seemed genuinely affected by Evan's death, as if some trace of the admiration he once felt for his former partner still lingered. But at other times, his voice hardened, revealing a suppressed anger he couldn't fully conceal. William watched every change in his body language, looking for clues that might contradict his version of events. Caleb was a complex man caught between the desire for justice and the weight of his own failures. Although his alibi seemed solid at first glance, Detective William couldn't completely rule out Caleb as a suspect. His motivation was clear: a deep resentment toward Evan, fueled by years of frustration and bitterness. Furthermore, his experience in the renewable energy sector made him capable of planning a crime as meticulous as the one committed. However, William knew that appearances could be deceiving. Until more conclusive evidence emerged, Caleb Ormsby would remain on the list of possible culprits. A man whose personal history was marked by truncated success and the shadow of betrayal. Lila Hawthorne, a 31-year-old woman with a sharp gaze and a consistently professional demeanor, had been Evan Thorne's executive assistant for the past 3 years. She was known at Thorne Renewables for her relentless efficiency and unwavering loyalty to her boss. However, that image of workplace harmony began to crumble recently when Lila abruptly submitted her resignation, citing irreconcilable differences as the official reason. Although she never offered specific details, office rumors suggested that something deeper was behind her decision, pent-up resentment that had been quietly brewing for months. According to some co-workers, Lila felt that Evan didn't adequately value her contributions to the business. Despite being the essential cog that kept the consulting firm running, She believed her efforts were constantly ignored or minimized. Beyond professional recognition, speculation also arose about possible emotional exploitation. Some employees commented that Evan often relied excessively on Lila, expecting her to be available at all hours of the day, even outside of work hours. This generated tensions that, although publicly concealed, seemed to have reached a critical point before her resignation. The detective knew that workplace relationships could be fertile ground for personal conflict, especially when unmet expectations and repressed emotions were mixed. During the interrogation, Lila appeared composed but distant, as if trying to maintain a barrier between herself and the detective's questions. Her version of events was clear. She claimed to have been in her Queens apartment, sleeping alone the entire night of the murder. There were no witnesses to corroborate this alibi, which left room for reasonable doubt. William carefully observed how Lila avoided certain topics, especially when asked about her relationship with Evan in the months before her departure from the company. The investigation revealed that Lila wasn't just upset about work-related issues. There was also the possibility that she knew too much about irregular financial activities within the consulting firm. According to some internal sources, Evan had been involved in exposing fraudulent practices within a contracting company associated with one of his projects. Lila, as his executive assistant, likely had access to confidential information that could compromise both Evan and other key players in those businesses. This hypothesis raised the possibility that Evan had threatened Lila to ensure her silence, turning her into a potential victim of coercion before turning her into a suspect. However, Lila steadfastly denied any involvement in the crime. Her tone was firm, almost defiant, but there were also moments when her voice trembled slightly, as if she were holding back deeper emotions. William noticed how she avoided making direct eye contact, a detail that could be interpreted in several ways: nervousness, embarrassment, or simply discomfort with the situation. Despite her apparent coolness, there was something about her demeanor that didn't quite add up. Perhaps it was her inability to provide a verifiable alibi, or perhaps it was the way she spoke of Evan, with a mixture of resentment and admiration that seemed contradictory. Beyond her official statement, Lila projected an intriguing complexity. On the one hand, it was clear she felt a deep resentment toward Evan, fueled by years of frustration and job discontent. But on the other, there also seemed to be an emotional connection that couldn't be entirely ignored. She had worked side by side with him for 3 years, and that closeness inevitably left its mark. William reflected on how human relationships are rarely completely black and white. Even amidst conflict, there can be glimmers of loyalty or affection that complicate the overall picture. Although Lila claimed to have been sleeping alone in her apartment during the crime, her lack of witnesses made her alibi vulnerable. William knew this didn't necessarily mean she was guilty, but it did put her in a delicate position. Furthermore, her potential access to sensitive information and her resentment toward Evan made her a central figure in the investigation. She was a young, ambitious woman, caught between the pressure of a demanding work environment and the consequences of decisions that might have pushed her too far. Until more compelling evidence emerged, Lila Hawthorne would remain under the detective's scrutiny, a crucial piece in the puzzle of a case that had yet to reveal all its potential. Jasper Quillen, a 49-year-old man with an imposing presence but steeped in secrets, was a well-known figure in renewable energy business circles. A representative of a contracting firm that worked closely with Thorne Renewables, Jasper had a controversial reputation in the industry. His name was associated with questionable business practices, and although he had always managed to avoid formal accusations, his record was not clean. He had been investigated in the past for fraud, although he was never convicted due to a combination of legal challenges and a lack of conclusive evidence. He was the kind of man who knew how to move within the shadows of the system, exploiting every loophole to protect his interests. Jasper's connection with Evan Thorne became particularly strained in the months leading up to the crime. Evan, known for his unwavering work ethic, had presented evidence to federal regulators implicating Jasper in a case of misappropriation of public funds intended for solar energy projects. These accusations not only threatened to destroy Jasper's reputation, but also to ruin him financially. If successful, he would face serious legal and financial consequences that could end his career. For someone like Jasper, whose life revolved around power and money, this prospect was unacceptable. Detective Elliot William knew that such personal motivations could be the perfect fuel for a desperate act. When the time came for the interrogation, Jasper presented himself with calculated calm, as if he had anticipated every question and meticulously prepared his answers. According to his statement, he had been in Chicago attending a business convention the night of the murder. Flight records confirmed that he returned to New York that morning, but there was no way to verify exactly what time he had arrived. This gap in his alibi left room for speculation. Had he had enough time to commit the crime before returning? William watched Jasper carefully as he spoke, noting how carefully he chose each word, as if trying to maintain a precarious balance between truth and manipulation. Beyond his official version, Jasper projected an intriguing mix of confidence and nervousness. At times, he seemed completely self-assured, answering the detective's questions precisely, but at other times, small gestures revealed an underlying tension, a light tapping of his fingers on the table, a pause that seemed too long before answering, or a gaze that slightly shifted when uncomfortable topics were raised. William knew these details could be significant. Jasper was no ordinary man. He was someone accustomed to handling complicated situations, and his demeanor during the interrogation reflected that experience. What made Jasper especially suspicious was his prior history and his direct relationship with Evan. The accusations Evan brought not only put him in a vulnerable position, but also exposed his modus operandi in the industry. Jasper had built his career on shaky foundations, taking advantage of corrupt systems and dubious connections. Now, with Evan out of the picture, these accusations could be put to rest, allowing him to continue his activities unhindered. William couldn't ignore the possibility that Jasper had seen murder as a permanent solution to his problems. However, the lack of hard evidence made it difficult to link him directly to the crime. His alibi, though incomplete, was solid enough to raise reasonable doubt. Furthermore, Jasper was an intelligent man, capable of planning every detail with surgical precision. If he had committed the crime, he had done so in a way that left as little trace as possible. This made the detective's job even more complex, forcing him to look for more subtle clues and less obvious connections. Detective William knew Jasper Quillen was a dangerous man. Not because he was physically intimidating, but because he possessed the ability to manipulate both people and circumstances to his advantage. His controversial reputation and direct connection to Evan made him a key suspect. But until more clear evidence emerged, his involvement in the crime remained an uncertain possibility. Jasper was a master of deception, and William was determined to find out if he had gone too far this time. After weeks of exhaustive investigation, the case took an unexpected turn when investigators conducted a detailed forensic analysis of a small, tree-shaped keychain found at the crime scene. At first glance, it seemed like an insignificant, almost forgettable object, but partial fingerprints recovered from the keychain matched those of Jasper Quillen. This discovery was crucial, as it directly connected Jasper to the murder scene. Initially, Jasper denied any connection to the object, but under police pressure, he admitted that the keychain had been a gift he had given Evan months earlier during a work dinner. According to his account, he had accidentally left it on the table while they were discussing details of a joint project. However, this testimony did not convince Detective Oliver William. Further analysis revealed microscopic traces of bleach on the keychain, suggesting that Jasper had handled it recently, likely while preparing his plan. This discovery was just the beginning of a series of tests that led to the unmasking of Jasper as the culprit. During the investigation, it was discovered that Jasper had been monitoring Evan's movements using a GPS device hidden in his briefcase. This device allowed investigators to track Evan's exact location at the time of the crime and prove that Jasper had precise knowledge of his activities. The technological evidence, combined with forensic analysis of the keychain, built a solid case against him. Finally, during intense interrogation, Jasper psychologically collapsed and confessed to having carefully planned the murder. He admitted to using the train ticket as a distraction and rigging the water bottle so that Evan would inadvertently ingest a lethal mixture of diluted bleach. The main motive behind the crime was to prevent Evan from testifying against him at an upcoming federal hearing. The charges Evan filed with federal regulators implicated Jasper in misusing public funds intended for solar energy projects. If these charges were successful, Jasper would face serious legal and financial consequences that could ruin him completely. Desperate to protect his reputation and his freedom, he decided to eliminate Evan before he could be publicly exposed. The killer used an insidious technique. He mixed bleach with water in a specific ratio to create a poison that would appear harmless to the naked eye. He knew Evan often drank large amounts of water during his long train rides and took advantage of this habit to carry out his plan. He tampered with the water bottle, adding the lethal mixture, ensuring that Evan would consume it without suspecting. The premeditation and cunning behind the act were evident. Jasper used everyday items such as the water bottle and the keychain to execute his plan without raising suspicion. However, he made crucial mistakes that ultimately exposed him. The use of the keychain, a personal item that directly linked him to Evan, was a colossal error. Furthermore, the GPS device's trace proved he knew exactly where Evan would be at the time of the crime, eliminating any possibility of a coincidence. The case concluded with Jasper's full confession, admitting to having acted out of fear and desperation. His attempt to cover up his actions using his expertise and resources was not enough to escape justice. Investigators emphasized the importance of seemingly insignificant details, such as the keychain and the train ticket, which unraveled the truth behind a meticulously planned crime. Jasper Quillen's trial was widely covered by the media, becoming a landmark case of corruption and desperation in the corporate world. During the trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: fingerprints on the keychain, traces of bleach, the GPS device, and Jasper's confession. His defense attempted to argue that he had acted under extreme duress and had no intention of causing physical harm, but these claims were dismissed in light of the clear premeditation of the crime. Jasper was found guilty of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced him to 35 years in prison without the possibility of early parole, highlighting the seriousness of the act and the devastating impact on Evan Thorne's family and colleagues. Jasper will also face civil lawsuits from the entities affected by his misuse of public funds. The consequences of the case spilled beyond the courtroom. Jasper's reputation was ruined, and his company was dismantled after further investigations revealed systemic fraudulent practices. Evan Thorne, on the other hand, was remembered as a tireless advocate for professional ethics and transparency. His legacy inspired regulatory changes in the renewable energy industry, promoting greater oversight to prevent similar cases. This tragic chapter served as a grim reminder of the human cost of unbridled ambition and impunity. Case 5. The night was chilly, but not enough to deter those attending the charity party in Central Park. The event, hosted by one of Manhattan's most prominent families, had brought together New York's elite under a starry sky and air that smelled faintly of dried leaves and luxury. It was the kind of evening that seemed like something out of a high-society romance novel. Long dresses that billowed with every step, sparkling jewels that competed with the stars, and laughter that floated through the trees like otherworldly whispers. No one could imagine that, while they danced and toasted, something terrible was happening right at the edge of the park, in one of New York's most iconic places, the Carousel. The Central Park Carousel, with its golden horses and magical atmosphere, had always been a symbol of nostalgia and fantasy. But that night, under the dim light of antique lamps, it became the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. At 11:45 p.m., as the bustle of the event began to dissipate and the last guests were leaving for their limousines, a security guard made his usual rounds. What he found left him frozen, unable to move for several seconds. There, sitting on one of the carousel's gilded horses, was Agatha Ashcroft, a young society debutante whose name would soon resonate in every headline. Her body remained upright, her head tilted slightly back, as if she were gazing at the stars or daydreaming. At first glance, she seemed asleep, wrapped in the almost ethereal stillness of the place. But something about that image didn't add up. Perhaps it was the bluish sheen on her lips or the tiny, almost imperceptible marks on her neck. Or maybe it was simply the feeling that something about that perfect tableau was deeply wrong. When investigators arrived at the scene, the first thing they noticed was how surprisingly clean everything was. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or disorder. No muffled screams, no struggles. However, upon closer examination, they discovered disturbing clues. Beneath the seat of the gilded horse where Agatha had been found, hidden in the shadows, lay a small empty vial. Beside it, half hidden among the carousel's metal ornaments, lay a discarded hypodermic needle. Both objects appeared to have been deliberately placed out of sight, as if the killer had wanted to leave a clue, but not an obvious one. The contents of the bottle turned out to be synthetic spider venom, an extremely rare and lethal substance that could only have been acquired through illegal channels or specialized laboratories. This was no ordinary crime. It was a premeditated act, calculated down to the last detail. The surgical precision with which the murder had been carried out in a public setting, surrounded by potential witnesses, was chilling. Yet no one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. How could someone commit such an elaborate murder without leaving a trace? That's when Brenda Covadonga, a veteran detective known as much for her razor-sharp intuition as for her unconventional style, entered the picture. Brenda wasn't your typical homicide investigator. With her black leather jacket, worn boots, and a barely visible scar across her left eyebrow, she looked more like an adventurer out of a detective movie than a law enforcement officer. But what truly made her stand out was her ability to see what others missed. Her colleagues often said Brenda had hawk eyes, capable of detecting invisible details even in the most chaotic scenarios. From the moment she stepped onto the carousel, Brenda knew this case would be different. While the others focused on the obvious, the physical evidence, the surroundings, she paused to observe the scene from another perspective. She noticed how Agata's body was positioned with excessive care, as if the killer had intended her death to be part of the narrative of the scene. She also sensed that the poison used wasn't just a means to kill, but a statement. Someone had deliberately chosen something unique, something that screamed intelligence and control. "This isn't just a murder," Brenda murmured as she walked around the carousel. "It's a macabre work of art. Whoever did this wanted us to admire it." With those words, the investigation took a new turn. Brenda knew that solving this case wouldn't just be a matter of following physical clues, but also of understanding the mind behind the crime. And although she still had no answers, one thing was certain. Whoever had murdered Agatha Ashcroft was playing a much bigger game than simply taking a life. Agatha Ashcroft, 22, was the only daughter of Lysander Ashcroft, a multi-millionaire real estate mogul, and Jimena Ashcroft, a former model turned philanthropist. Raised in a privileged environment, Agatha lived surrounded by luxury, but also by high expectations. From a young age, she showed an aversion to the family business and exclusive parties that defined her social circle. Instead, she developed a deep passion for contemporary art, specializing in sculpture and experimental design at Columbia University. Her independent temperament and critical spirit led her to constantly challenge the social norms imposed by her environment. However, behind her seemingly perfect life, Agatha hid a dark side. She had disputes with her father over her inheritance and the management of family properties, which generated tensions. Furthermore, rumors of clandestine romances with people outside her social circle caused conflict with her mother, Jimena. Weeks before her death, she expressed concern to close friends about anonymous threats she had received, although she never revealed details. This erratic behavior, coupled with her complicated personal life, now seems to foreshadow the tragedy that marked her untimely fate. Caius Davenport, 30, was a man whose ambition had led him to rise rapidly in the world of real estate. As Lysander Ashcroft's protege, he held the position of joint director in the prestigious family firm, a position envied by many and achieved by few. However, his relationship with the family wasn't as perfect as it seemed from the outside. Recently, tensions had arisen between him and Agatha Ashcroft, the only child of Lysander and Serafina. Their differences centered around a development project in Brooklyn, one that promised to be revolutionary in both architectural and economic terms. Agatha, with her creative vision and desire to lead something beyond her social sphere, wanted to take the reins of the project. For her, it wasn't just about constructing buildings. It was an opportunity to leave her mark on the city she loved so much. Caius, on the other hand, viewed the project from a more pragmatic and traditional perspective. He knew that if Agatha managed to convince her father to allow him to lead it, his own aspirations within the company could be thwarted. Not only that, there was also the latent fear that she might uncover certain secrets he preferred to keep hidden. Among them was the persistent rumor of a secret relationship between Caius and Serafina Ashcroft, Agatha's mother. Although never publicly confirmed, this clandestine connection added a layer of complexity to the already tense family dynamic. The relationship, if it existed, could have been interpreted as a betrayal by Agatha, who had always been protective of her mother and critically observant of those who got too close to her family. When Detective Brenda Covadonga began investigating the case, Caius was one of the first names to appear on her list of suspects. During interrogation, he maintained a calm but firm demeanor, asserting that he had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. According to his statement, He had been participating in a meeting with key investors in Midtown until 11:30 p.m., at which point he returned directly to his apartment. Two of the investors present at the meeting confirmed his account, though they admitted one crucial detail. Caius had briefly left the room for a few minutes. This lapse in his alibi, though brief, was enough to capture the detective's attention. What had he done during those minutes? Had he had enough time to travel to Central Park and commit the crime? The investigation revealed that Caius was well versed in the use of advanced chemicals due to his experience with construction projects requiring specialized materials. This made him someone with potential access to synthetic poisons like the one used in the murder. Furthermore, his close relationship with the Ashcroft family gave him intimate knowledge of Agatha's habits and movements, which could have made it easier for him to plan the crime. However, despite these clues, there was no direct evidence linking Caius to the empty vial or hypodermic needle found on the carousel. Beyond the objective facts, what truly caught Brenda's attention was the contrast between Caius's imperturbable appearance and the underlying emotions that seemed to simmer beneath the surface. He was a man who had learned to play his cards carefully, always weighing every word and action to protect his position. But in the moments when he let his guard down even slightly, a mixture of anxiety and frustration was evident. Perhaps it was the weight of the secrets he carried, or perhaps simply the fear of losing everything he had built. Whatever the reason, it was clear that Caius Davenport was not a man to leave loose ends, or at least that's what he tried to pretend. 26-year-old Isolde Monroe was an emerging artist whose career was beginning to gain recognition in the competitive world of contemporary art. Known for her vibrant and experimental style, Isolde had collaborated closely with Agatha Ashcroft on several exhibitions that had been celebrated by critics and the public alike. For a time, the two women shared a close friendship, fueled by their mutual passion for art and creativity. However, that relationship had recently deteriorated due to a dispute that left deep emotional scars on both parties. The conflict revolved around a piece of artwork they had created together, a work that combined the distinctive elements of their styles and quickly captured the attention of the art world. Isolde felt that Agatha had betrayed her trust by claiming full credit for their joint work, presenting it as if it were primarily her creation. This act, according to Isolde, not only stripped her of the recognition she deserved, but also undermined her credibility in a medium where originality and authenticity are paramount. The tension between the two escalated further when Isolde lost a significant grant that Agatha had initially helped her secure. According to Isolde, Agatha had promised to support her in securing the funding, but then refused to share it, arguing that the grant was intended exclusively for her own projects. This decision not only left her in a precarious financial situation, but also fueled her resentment toward Agatha. For Isolde, this series of events was not simply a professional disagreement, but a personal betrayal that undermined her trust in someone she had once considered her closest friend. Although she tried to maintain a facade of professionalism in public, those who knew Isolde noticed how her frustration and pain were beginning to manifest in her behavior, making her more withdrawn and distant as the days passed. When investigators questioned her about her whereabouts on the night of the murder, Isolde stated that she had been in her studio until late, working on a new work. She described how she had spent hours immersed in her creative process, seeking to channel her emotional anguish into something tangible and beautiful. However, she had no witnesses who could corroborate her story. Her studio, located in a quiet, low-traffic building, offered her privacy, but also made her alibi lacking external verification. Investigators noted the absence of hard evidence to support her testimony, which placed her in a vulnerable position within the investigation. The environment in which Isolde worked reflected her personality, chaotic yet vibrant, with unfinished canvases stacked against the walls and pots of paint scattered on the floor. Every corner of the space seemed to tell a story of struggle and perseverance, but also of loneliness. For Isolde, art was both a refuge and a way to express her grief. And that night, as she worked in silence, she was perhaps seeking to make sense of the tensions that had shaped her recent life. However, her lack of a solid alibi and her obvious resentment toward Agatha made her a central figure in the investigation, forcing detectives to question whether her grief could have driven her to commit an act driven by anger and despair. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Isolde was not simply a talented artist, but a woman plagued by internal and external conflicts that defined her present. Her relationship with Agatha, marked by shared creativity and subsequent betrayal, highlighted the complexities of human relationships, especially in a world where success and recognition can be as fragile as they are ephemeral. Thorne Blackwood, 28, was a man whose life revolved around science and precision. As a leading biochemist at a pharmaceutical laboratory in Queens, he had earned a reputation for his ability to solve complex problems and develop innovative solutions. However, behind his methodical exterior and professional brilliance, Thorne hid a deeply private and obsessive personality. He was the type of person who preferred to work in silence, immersed in his thoughts, while the outside world seemed to blur before his eyes. His colleagues described him as dedicated to the point of compulsion, a man who rarely made room for social interactions beyond what was strictly necessary. It was at a charity gala, months before the crime, that Thorne met Agatha Ashcroft. From the first moment, he was captivated by her. It wasn't just her beauty that attracted him, but also her independent spirit and passion for art. For Thorne, Agatha represented something beyond his reach, a world full of color, creativity, and freedom, very different from the sterile, controlled environment of his laboratory. A kind of friendship quickly began to form between them, though never a balanced one. While Thorne idealized Agatha, placing her on an almost unreal pedestal, she saw him simply as an occasional confidant, someone with whom she could share interesting conversations without becoming emotionally involved. Although this relationship worked for Agatha, for Thorne it became an obsession that slowly began to consume him. When Agatha abruptly decided to end their friendship, perhaps without even realizing the impact it would have on him, Thorne felt his world crumble. According to some close friends, he began to show signs of emotional instability. He spoke of Agatha with a mixture of admiration and resentment, as if he couldn't understand why she had rejected him. His behavior became erratic, alternating between periods of intense work in the lab and moments of deep introspection. Some even noted that he had begun to carry a small notebook where he jotted down details about Agatha, as if he wanted to capture every fragment of her existence for preservation. Detective Brenda Covadonga soon focused her attention on Thorne due to his connection to Agatha and his specialized knowledge of advanced chemicals. During interrogation, Thorne claimed to have been in his lab reviewing data until late on the night of the murder. The building's access logs confirmed that he had entered around 10 p.m. and hadn't left until after midnight. However, one crucial detail caught the detective's attention. There were no operational cameras in that specific area of the lab. This meant that although the log showed Thorne was physically present, there was no way to verify exactly what he had been doing during that time. What intrigued Brenda most was the duality in Thorne's personality. On the one hand, he was a brilliant scientist, capable of creating complex compounds with pinpoint precision. On the other, he was a deeply disturbed man, obsessed with a woman who likely never saw him the same way. His lab environment, filled with flasks, microscopes, and high-tech equipment, seemed to reflect both his genius and his isolation. It was easy to imagine how someone like Thorne could have used his skills to manufacture something as lethal as synthetic spider venom, but it was also impossible to ignore the possibility that his obsession had driven him to cross boundaries he'd never before considered. Beyond the objective facts, what truly troubled Brenda was the emotional fragility that seemed to lurk beneath Thorne's surface. He was a man who lived in a world of extremes where admiration could quickly turn to resentment and love to possession. Perhaps in his mind he believed he was protecting Agatha, or freeing her from something she couldn't see. Or perhaps he simply couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Whatever the truth, Thorne Blackwood was a man whose actions were driven by a dangerous mix of devotion and desperation, a combination that could drive anyone to the brink. 24-year-old Callista Vale was an incisive and ambitious journalist, known for her ability to unravel complex stories that others preferred to leave unsaid. Her job involved covering high society events, a world where perfect smiles and expensive dresses often concealed much darker secrets. Throughout her career, Callista had interviewed Agatha Ashcroft on several occasions, and although the two maintained a cordial relationship, a professional distance always existed between them. Agatha, with her independent temperament and critical spirit, seemed to be an intriguing figure for Callista, someone whose life was full of contrasts and contradictions. However, this relationship, although superficially friendly, was thrust into the spotlight when the possibility arose that Agatha possessed key information about an explosive article Callista was investigating. The article in question revolved around corruption in the real estate industry, a topic that touched Agatha's family directly, especially her father, Lysander Ashcroft. a billionaire tycoon whose empire had been built on opaque transactions and questionable political deals. According to rumors, Agatha had been collecting documents and evidence that could expose not only her father, but also several influential associates within his circle. For Callista, this information represented a unique opportunity to consolidate her reputation as an investigative journalist, but it also posed a moral dilemma. How far would she be willing to go to obtain this story? Some suspected that Callista's interest in Agatha had gone beyond merely professional, and that, in her eagerness to protect her exclusive, she might have considered eliminating her before she spoke. When questioned by the detective, Callista stated that she had been in her apartment that night, editing material related to her investigation. She described how she had spent hours in front of her computer, reviewing recordings, notes, and documents, trying to piece together the puzzle that promised to be her next big story. Her boyfriend corroborated that she had been home for most of the night, but admitted that Callista had briefly gone out to buy coffee at a nearby cafe. This detail, though seemingly insignificant, raised some concern among investigators. The time Callista spent outside her apartment roughly coincided with the estimated time of the murder, raising the possibility that she had taken advantage of that brief window to commit the crime. Callista's personality was a reflection of her profession, meticulous, calculating, and extremely dedicated. Her apartment, organized down to the last detail, seemed like the perfect space for someone obsessed with the pursuit of the truth. On her desk, folders full of notes and photographs were carefully labeled, while maps hung on the walls with markings and connections drawn in red marker. It was clear that Callista had invested a lot of time and effort into her investigation, and that she was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the consequences. However, her obsession with the story also raised difficult questions. Had she allowed her ambition to cloud her judgment? Was it possible for someone so young and passionate to have crossed the line between ethical journalism and dangerous manipulation? As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Callista was not simply an observer of the elite world, but someone who had begun to become part of its shadows. Her relationship with Agatha, though professional in appearance, was colored by personal and professional interests that complicated any attempt to interpret her actions. The time gap in her alibi, coupled with her potential access to sensitive information, made her involvement in the case difficult to rule out. However, it was also possible that Callista was simply a talented journalist, caught in a web of conspiracies much larger than herself, a collateral victim of a system that punishes those who seek to reveal the truth. The murder of Agatha Ashcroft was a masterpiece of calculation and precision, but also an act driven by Thorne Blackwood's obsession and emotional breakdown. What began as a personal experiment in his laboratory turned into a tragedy when his unhealthy idealization of Agatha collapsed under the weight of rejection. Thorne had developed the synthetic spider venom not with malicious intent at first, but as part of his fascination with creating something unique, something that reflected his scientific genius. However, his troubled mind soon found another purpose for his creation: to protect Agatha from those he considered his enemies. In his distorted view, he believed the world was hostile and that only he could save her. When Agatha abruptly ended their friendship, Thorne felt everything he'd built emotionally between them crumble. His obsession mutated into quiet rage and, finally, desperation. For him, the only way to keep her safe was to eliminate her before others could harm her. His twisted logic led him to meticulously plan the crime, choosing the Central Park carousel as the perfect setting. He knew the charity event would draw hundreds of people, allowing him to blend into the crowd without raising suspicion. Furthermore, the bustle and music would mask any unusual movement. On the night of the murder, Thorne arrived prepared. He carried a small, modified air gun, a nearly invisible device he had designed specifically for this purpose. The mechanism was equipped with a tiny hypodermic needle loaded with synthetic spider venom. During the event, Thorne approached Agatha as she admired the golden horses of the carousel. Using a casual excuse, he pretended to adjust her collar, using that moment to press the device against her neck and administer the venom. The act was so swift that not even Agatha noticed what was happening. The venom worked quickly, rendering her unconscious within minutes. Thorne delicately placed her on one of the horses, ensuring that she appeared asleep to avoid raising immediate suspicion. What Thorne didn't anticipate was that his obsessive perfectionism would betray him. While developing the poison in his abandoned Staten Island lab, He had used a unique phosphorescent compound to mark chemical samples. A microscopic fragment of that paint remained stuck to the empty vial he carelessly discarded on the carousel. This seemingly insignificant detail was the key that led to his capture. Investigators traced the encrypted coordinates found on Agatha's phone back to the lab, where they discovered irrefutable evidence that Thorne had manufactured the poison. Under interrogation, Thorne confessed everything, revealing how his obsession had consumed him to the point of committing such a heinous act. Although his initial intention had been to protect Agatha, his inability to handle the rejection led him to a dark place from which he could not return. His need for absolute control over her transformed into an act of lethal possession, proving that even the most brilliant geniuses can fall victim to their own overwhelming emotions. The trial for the murder of Agatha Ashcroft became a media spectacle that captured the nation's attention. Isolde Munro and Callista Vale, the prime suspects in the investigation, faced public scrutiny, although neither was formally charged due to a lack of conclusive evidence. However, Thorne Blackwood, whose obsession and actions were irrefutably proven, was found guilty of premeditated murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented compelling evidence, from the synthetic poison manufactured in his laboratory to the phosphorescent paint fragment that directly linked the bottle found on the carousel to his work. Thorne was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, marking the end of a life blighted by obsession and an inability to accept rejection. The consequences of the case also extended beyond the verdict. Isolde's reputation was tarnished, affecting her artistic career, while Callista abandoned journalism after being singled out as a potential accomplice in public rumors. For the Ashcroft family, the case left irreparable wounds. Lysander and Jimena grew even further apart, while Agatha's legacy was marked not only by her artistic talent but also by the tragedy surrounding her untimely death. The case served as a grim reminder of how personal ambitions, resentments, and secrets can converge into devastating outcomes,